So throughout the book, I try to show that literature offers a special place from which to think singularity, precisely because literature is resistant, at least in my mind, to full conceptualization or explanation. And being resistant to full conceptualization or explanation, is not a kind of foreclosure of our subjectivity, but to my mind, and it's the hope of this book, that it is an opening to thought and an opening to liberation. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chatterjee. Would you like to select the winner of the...
Okay, I hope I'm pronouncing your name wrong. Correct me if I'm not. Shamara?
Oh, yes, I did. For you, you're welcome. Okay, so I'm going to go next. Jessica, how do you feel about being mobile? Is that a pain in the... Yes?
I don't love it.
I will be stationary. Thank you so much to Jessica Traynor and to Meg Bryan for all of the comms work that goes into putting together this series. And there's a lot more work ahead, but we are very grateful. And great suppliers for helping us. So what I thought might be useful is to provide a little bit of background on how this particular book, Carrying the Burden of Peace, Reimagining Indigenous Masculinities Through Story, came to be. For those, I guess I was supposed to introduce myself. So my name's Sam. I'm a white settler scholar of Indigenous literatures primarily, and I work on Indigenous sport and decolonization and sporting spaces a bit these days. But this particular project is one that I started working on over 15 years ago, I would say. And as a non-Indigenous person who works with Indigenous artistic production, I have often sought to work on projects that I see as emerging from cues to criticism within the text themselves. In other words, prompts that I see that are inviting of further analysis. And around 2005, so I just finished my PhD, I was no longer under the safe wing of Glenn Wilmot here in the department, and thinking about what a next major project might look like. And at that point, I recall reading several novels primarily, but also some autobiographies by Indigenous writers, mainly from Canada, that in which surrogate brotherhood was a really important theme. And oftentimes it was a somewhat non-self-assured protagonist who was negotiating the attractive pull yet potential violence of a surrogate brother figure in the story. And I thought that this really had something to do with considerations of masculinity and problematics of colonial intrigue. And so I thought maybe I would try to do some work in this area. And what I thought I ought to do is read some Indigenous masculinity theory. And as someone who didn't come through a gender studies schooling, I was seeking this out at that time, like not from my previous learning. And what I found was there wasn't a lot written, okay? And there's good reasons for that. If we consider the imposition of heteropatriarchy as a central violent impulse of settler colonialism, there are reasons why there has been reticence around foregrounding masculinity in critical theory on Indigenous matters in North America. So there, at this time that I'm talking about, sort of 2007-ish, lots of crucial Indigenous feminist theory and Indigenous queer and two-spirit theory is just taking off at that moment. But there wasn't a lot written on Indigenous masculinities. And I remember the great Stalo writer Lee Maracle saying to me shortly after that, when I was asking her about this, there's not a real body of literature on this stuff. And she said, well, there's bodies of knowledge on this stuff. It's just not in the books you're talking about, right? And so there's a lot of understanding and awareness, but not in the critical language that I was conversant in as a literary scholar. So I thought, well, what can I do as a non-Indigenous person who thinks that the writers are asking folks to think about these matters? And it certainly wasn't producing the Indigenous masculinity theory. What I thought I might be able to do is curate conversations in which some of that theory might evolve. And so what I did was I put together an interview project where I ended up interviewing, I think at the end, it was about 30 Indigenous artists, intellectuals, authors, activists, and elders, and had conversations about gender and masculinity and the colonial process. And that became a book called Masculindians, Conversations about Indigenous Manhood. And that book, I think, was significant in the sense that it brought some of those conversations to the fore and suggested sort of the value in thinking about masculinity not only as a deficit or not only as an imposition, but as something that might be claimed in a generative fashion. So that book comes out in 2014, and you know, from 2007 when I started working on this stuff to 2014, and then shortly thereafter, significant publications start coming out by Indigenous theorists on Indigenous masculinities. And there were a couple major events that were conferences on Indigenous masculinity, some things at NASA. And so there was a body of conversation into which I might present some thoughts as an outsider. And the other part of kind of moving toward actually writing this book was a sense of responsibility to those who had shared their ideas and thoughts with me. I remember a long while ago speaking with a residential school survivor who's a friend, and the comment being a reiteration of something that's come through TRC stuff several times, which is, my story is a gift, you do something with it, right? It doesn't just sit there if you don't actually retain a sense of honor to that story. So anyway, I started working on this book. It came out in 2021. So yeah, it was about a 15-year process. And I'm quite pleased with it. I mean, it means a lot to me. It's dealing with some pretty difficult matters. And one of the things that, if you do get a chance to read it, I try to reckon with the fact that some of the folks that I spoke with in the conversations that led to Masculindians have since been determined to be perpetrators in their own communities. And what does that mean to hold up the voices of people who are speaking about honoring masculinities and are behaving in ways that are significantly different from that. So what I thought I'd do is read just a couple short passages from the book, and then I will pass things over to Brooke. Can a critical examination of Indigenous masculinities be an honor song? One that celebrates rather than pathologizes? One that holds people and institutions to account but seeks after diversity and strength rather than evidence of harm? One that struggles to overturn patriarchy without making colonialism its focus? Can a critical examination of Indigenous masculinities be an embodied enterprise, be creative, be erotic, even be funny? Countering the perception that masculinity has been so contaminated by settler colonialism as to be irredeemable. My book, I say my talk, because clearly I've excerpted this from the talk. It's honestly in the book. The book examines Indigenous literature and film to consider whether Indigenous masculinities might be valuable in efforts toward decolonization. My argument is pretty simple. If we understand masculinity as pertaining to qualities connected in some way with maleness, and we recognize that there are individuals within Indigenous families, communities, and nations who identify as male, or with masculinity regardless of biology, then the concession that masculinity exists only in its dominant negative manifestations bears stark consequences. It means that the resources available to affirm those subjectivities will be limited, which is why, in the words of Cherokee scholar Daniel Heath Justice, literature ought to give us alternatives. In carrying the burden of peace, I try to illuminate ways of understanding masculinity that exceed settler colonial logics. Ultimately, I contend that masculinities can indeed be included among the resources called upon in in the words of Anishinaabe author Leanne Batazamozage Simpson, to ensure, or help ensure, every Indigenous body knows respect in their bones. However, only if masculinities are liberated from biological determinism, anthropocentrism, and the dominant relationships among gender, race, and power that have come to be normalized in contemporary North American society. In this book, I discuss novels and short stories by Eden Robinson, Richard Van Camp, Leanne Simpson, poetry by Billy Ray Belcourt, Smokey Sumac, Louise Haff, and Gregory Schofield, traditional stories shared by Tom Porter, Jeanette Armstrong, and Anthony Apicard Thrasher, and a short film by Mohawk Heiltsuk filmmaker Zoe Lee Hopkins. Now, I obviously don't have time to engage with all of these here, but I want to just share a couple of remarks from the book that are spurred by Hopkins' short film, Mohawk Midnight Runners. Has anyone seen Mohawk Midnight Runners? Okay, well, that's not enough of you, but I'm glad Ruth has. It's in the library on DVD. You probably don't have a DVD player, but you can get it there. It's a fabulous movie. Hopkins' 2013 short film, which is adapted from a short story by Tlicho writer Richard Van Camp, tells the story of Grant, a young Mohawk man played by Cree actor Cody Lightning, who deals with the death of a friend by suicide by adopting that friend's practice of late-night streaking. Grant is initially mocked by two male friends when they spot him running naked with Jeff Miracle's dog. But there is gentleness in the ridicule of these friends, and the three young men end up pursuing a nightly ritual of streaking together as a community. So at the very end of the book, I write the following. Mohawk Midnight Runners gifts its audience with inspired reimaginings of Indigenous masculinities, as the young Ganyangahaga men pursue responsibilities as nurturers, protectors, and caregivers. And the film does more than reimagine. It offers depictions of masculinities that precede, succeed, and exceed colonial limitations. Masculinities that are embodied yet spiritual, empowered yet vulnerable, hilarious yet deadly serious. Masculinities that nurture both the full humanity of Indigenous peoples and the empowered futures of Indigenous nations. Hopkins refuses to concede to the inherited simulations of Indigenous masculinity, but at the same time, she refuses to deny men communities of jocular posturing and laughter that can create conditions in which sharing and mutual support become possible. Mohawk Midnight Runners thus constitutes a creative intervention that is as practical as it is visionary, as epitomized by its protagonist Grant's simple assertion, "I want more," which should come up when I press this. There. Indigenous masculinities are more than what settler colonialism has taught us. The simulations of Indigenous masculinities propagated in mainstream culture and the myopic masculinities disciplined through residential schooling and the Indian Act, these are not, nor have they ever been, the only masculinities available to us. These profound failures of imagination exist to quarantine and contain our gender knowledges. Indigenous literature and film offer more generative and world-building possibilities. They reach to and participate in what Cherokee scholar Coley Driscoll calls a much larger memory that stretches all the way back. They interrogate the violence through which that memory in many cases has been rent from our knowing, and they generate new memories still via stories armed to nurture a more just and balanced world. Thanks very much.